I was coming into church for an early meeting. As I came up to the side of the church, going over to my coffee place, I noticed that there was a commotion happening in front of the church, and there were a couple of people who were very agitated and were standing up above someone who was laying down on the side of our church. And I started walking over there to see what was going on. They were standing above someone who was laying under a blanket. And this was a person who had been asleep and had been sleeping on the street the night before, and who it seemed had gone to sleep on some of the steps that go into a part of the church which is shielded away from the rain and the wind. It looked as if the man who was on the ground was wearing blue gloves, or those blue latex gloves, or something. It looked very strange. I saw that the people who were standing there on the street, agitated, that they were touching the man and trying to wake him up. They asked me, do you know who this is? And I looked down at the man's face, and his face was just as blue as his hands. I could tell immediately when I looked at his face that something was really terribly wrong, and that the man had died. These two men called the ambulance to come, and I realized that what had happened was that a person who had gone to sleep on our church steps, because he doesn't have another place to sleep at night, had laid down beneath a blanket to keep himself warm, and that overnight he had died. And that's where we had found his body, was laying on the side of the steps of the church. I knew that the only right thing for me to do was to remain standing with this man's body until, and at least as long as he was laying there, until the authorities took away his body. It would seem very disrespectful to me to leave, to walk away. So I stood there for about an hour and a half. During the course of that time, the paramedics arrived in an ambulance, and they immediately knew that this man had died. This section of the church is directly next to a glass enclosed escalator for the Copley T station. And so over the course of this hour and a half, there were hundreds and hundreds of people who were walking into and coming out of this train station, going through their day, going through with their own worries and their own things that they were trying to take care of for that day. And some of them were aware of what happened, and some of them were completely unaware. They were absorbed in their music or absorbed in their paper, and the medical examiner, having collected up the man's belongings, that what he had with him, and taken away his body, and one of the authorities, a person who had been there much of the time that I'd been standing there, took the blanket and the sheet that the man had been laying under, which is a very common sight in the city. They're gray blankets that all seem to be the same, that people sleep under. And he had taken this blanket and the sheet that the man had been laying under, and he took it and went to throw it away. And it seemed wrong to me that this blanket, which had become a kind of a death shroud, would be thrown away as if it had no value. And so, not really knowing what else to do, not knowing what I would do, having made this decision, I went to the garbage, and I took it out of the garbage. And so this is the blanket and the sheet that this man had been laying under when he died. And so I took it and I washed them and I've pressed them, and now I have them sitting in my office and I'm still considering what to do with them right now. I think that what I would like to do is to have an artist turn it into something beautiful, something that will serve as a reminder for me of this man and his death.
Long Island in Boston Harbor was a place where there were many, many services for people who were struggling in life. There was a battered women's shelter, there were lots of recovery services. There was also a large shelter where I think about 700 people were housed, some on an occasional basis and some nightly.
This shelter served a very important purpose because it was the largest shelter in the city, and it always had beds, even on the coldest nights, even when things were the most crowded. There were always beds at the Long Island shelter. And so this would serve as the shelter for people who were in an emergency situation, who were at their last resort, people who normally who would try to stay away from sleeping in homeless shelters, but it was so bitterly cold, or for some other reason they needed to not be outside for that day, they were sick, or for any other reason, you would always be able to have a bed somewhere to sleep inside that was warm at the Long Island shelter. So that was a purpose that the Long Island shelter served. And so in October of that year, when that bridge was shut down, there was suddenly this terrible upheaval in the lives of people who were already experiencing difficulties in their lives because they were homeless.
2 years at Long Island. I've been homeless for 5. When I first became homeless, I was at Long Island for 2 years. And that is like Bartertown. I don't know if you've ever seen Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, but that's what the Long Island shelter was. But it helped people. It was a home for us, you know, and we weren't on the street. And, you know, you hear a lot of horror stories about the island, but the island wasn't that bad. It wasn't. You know, you got a group of friends like we had, you know, and we hung out together and they got smoking cigarettes and maybe a joint or something, but the staff was horrible. Long Island staff was horrible. They treated you like you were a kindergarten kid, you know? And they're like, I am older than you, don't talk to me like that.
And the access to that island, where all these services were held, was across a rickety bridge that had been aging and ready for deconstruction for some time. That bridge was abruptly closed just at the onset of winter, with no provisions in place for the people who were using the services or sleeping on the island. Many people had nowhere to go. Quite a few were in the middle of detox or in very vulnerable situations. And so the abrupt closing of the Long Island Bridge displaced vast numbers of people and caused enormous disruption. And there were people freezing on the street who had no place to go.
People who had their belongings stored on the island couldn't access them. People who were used to staying at that shelter weren't able to sleep there anymore, and the replacement services that the city put into place were far beneath what they had before the bridge was condemned. So there were hundreds of people who were sleeping on cots on a basketball court, and people who were sleeping in hallways of hospitals. There was something that used to be a morgue, which they converted into places for people to sleep, so that homeless people were sleeping in a morgue. This was supposed to be just a very temporary thing, but it stretched on for weeks into months, where the city of Boston just could not open a replacement shelter quickly enough.
And they gave us these little shelters that do not fit all the people that were at the island. And it seems like they don't want to. It took them forever to open that stuff up, because they just don't care. You know, we're a statistic. We don't. You know, they don't realize we're not just bums, man. You know, then that's how they look at us. They don't look at us as working members of society. You know, they don't get that, and they see you walk by and they go, oh yeah, there's a guy asking for this or asking for that. And, you know, it's either that or, you know, go rob people and stuff, which is, you know, I mean, there's not a whole lot of options. Maybe they should come down here and check it out. You know, maybe they can work on some ideas, but they really just don't care. You know, so I don't think they're doing much at all. In fact, we're going backwards. We're going backwards, you know.
So I called my good colleague, Reverend Dr. Nancy Taylor, and she said, you know what, we need to do something. I said, yeah, we need to do something. So we called the first meeting at Old South Church, and Nancy invited people, Christine Rathbone, who you might have met from the Manna community, and Mass Council of Churches, and the Jewish Community Relations Council. And so we met and pulled this meeting together. And at first we said, oh, if we get 10 people, we'll be happy. And so we put out 10 chairs, and then one by one, another 60 people walked into the room. We had like 70 some odd people at that first meeting, all concerned about what happened.
In response to this, many people from faith communities around the Boston area gathered and began to try to lobby the city to put in place emergency humanitarian measures. And the city was feeling under fire from all sides and was slow to respond.
Everything got real quiet. Everything. The media talked about the closing a little bit. There was some stuff from homeless people, but the city, it took them another 2 to 3 weeks to have a public hearing. They heard from a lot of people who were on Long Island. They heard from people in the South End who were saying, well, I know you're having the meeting here, but please don't let those people come down here and be located. They heard from providers, you know, people who were providing services like Victory programs and Bay Cove Human Services had actual programs out there for recovery, and their staffs were laid off immediately and told, don't go back, you can't go back to work.
The community was frustrated when the Long Island Bridge closed. The unhoused community, the community that supports the unhoused community, faith communities, politicians, people were really frustrated. I mean, it happened in a moment, and all of a sudden there was a loss of beds, and the community, whether you're just talking about the unhoused or the huge community of people around the issue, really were frustrated and got together, and there were open houses, and there were rallies, and there was all different sorts of actions being taken to say, this isn't right, and what are we going to do? And it was the faith community that got together that came up with Boston Warm.
And so we broke ourselves into thinking about what we could do short term, what we could do in the medium, and what we could do in the long term. The long term was how we started to do the advocacy work. The medium was like thinking about, can we open our churches up for people to come in during this cold winter?
And so the faith community, the entire faith community, got together in Boston and said, what are we going to do about this? And the plans varied. You know, we brainstormed for a couple of weeks there. What can we do? And what they came up with is that the churches, some of them at least, could be open during the day.
Churches are ill-equipped to offer overnight shelter. Overnight shelter is a whole other ball game. It takes significant professional resources, and we were going to operate not as professionals, but as compassionate citizens. When the idea was proposed and people began to say, well, how do you open a drop-in center? Does anybody know how to open one? There were people who turned and looked right at me because I had just opened one. My plan at that time was to focus all my energies on a brand new initiative at First Church in Cambridge, where I'm on the staff, to open the Friday Cafe as a weekly gathering place. And so I had just started this, and I had an operating plan in place, and I had some idea of what would go into it. And so I was a natural person to turn to at that time. It was not part of my plan in any way, shape, or form to open a second venue, but that we were in the middle of a crisis, and so I said yes.
So there's still the homeless crisis that's happening. There's a crisis in the sense that that space was taken away from us, that there is no longer those beds there. The city has worked hard to open up new shelters, but the question is, what's going to happen there? And that's what, there's still rallies, there's still other organizations that are gathering on a monthly basis to say, we want that space back. I don't know what will happen there. I don't know what the city wants to do. I don't know those larger plans. What I know is that we will strive every day, Long Island, no Long Island, you know, no matter what the makeup of the city does, we want to make sure that we are a place that everybody feels welcome.
And we specifically chose the name Boston Warm to echo the Boston Strong motto that had arisen after the bombing, the marathon bombing, when Boston responded by really pulling together, and everybody put on Boston Strong bracelets, and it was a symbol of our unity. And I believe it was Laura Everett of the Mass Council of Churches who was the first one to say, a city that can respond to a terrorist attack should be able to respond to a human emergency.
And quickly there, it became a staple. It became one of the places people went. It became not just a response to a crisis, but a much needed service. And then all of a sudden what happened was that the service became needed more and more and more. It became a part of people's understanding of their identity of Boston. And all of a sudden it became its own thing. It was no longer a response to a crisis. It was a needed community in Boston.
The very first day that we opened Boston Warm, there were 3 of us running the program, and we had set up coffee, and we got all of our storage lockers ready, and we had some cookies, I think. We opened the door at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning or a Tuesday morning, and 40 or 50 people were already in line and filed in. We were in shock. That word had already gone out that we were going to offer. It was January by this time, 3 months after the closing of the bridge. And 40 or 50 freezing cold people filed into Boston Warm. We were in complete shock. And a couple of them I knew, most of them I had never seen before. Most of them were from the neighborhood of Copley Square, because that's where Boston Warm opened, in the basement of Old South Church. And the first 3 or 4 weeks were just daily boot camp for us. Like every day threw challenges at us that we had never experienced, and we had to be tough, and we had to be resilient, and we had to be completely improvisational, and it was exhausting at first, but it was also incredibly beautiful, just so beautiful to be community together in that small space.
One of the first weeks we were open, somebody was in and they had a need. I don't remember if it was a pair of socks or a t-shirt or something, and another homeless individual said, "Oh, I have an extra pair. Here, you take this." And that is, I think, the embodiment of what we have built at Boston Warm. It is a community. It is a safe, sane place where people can come and feel like there are no threats to them. They're treated like real human beings.
When I first heard about Boston Warm, I was absolutely thrilled about it. I looked it up on the internet. I became involved from a distance and through my connections on the phone. He told me names about Pastor Kate, and I friended her on Facebook, and it just made me feel closer, but it also made me feel like I could have times in my life when I could relax, when I could say, okay, it's cold, it's snowing, but I know he's okay. He's with people that really care and understand him, and yet he's warm, he's got something to eat, and that was huge. It's huge as a parent who they love their sons, they are frustrated, they can't be there, but yet on the other hand, to know that there's a place to go, a place that has a little bit of structure, a place that you're not just hanging on the street, it's so important. And I believe in it 100%. I was so disappointed when I first learned that it was 3 days a week. I thought, oh, if he had a place to go every day, that would be so awesome.
I believe that what the unhoused community in Boston needs most is an open and welcoming community. That there is nothing that somebody could do that would separate them from our community. That it is ever loving, it is forever welcoming to those people, that if it is a day that is hard and decisions in life haven't gone well, and you might feel like you aren't deserving of a loving community, that is especially when we want to be that loving community that welcomes people in. What you can find is companionship, an advocate in life, that person that will stand by your side and support you through navigating a process in Boston that can be daunting. The process of finding housing or finding appropriate health care or finding legal services or whatever that need is can be very daunting. And what you find at Common Cathedral is the people that are going to support you through that will celebrate with you when you are ready and excited with joys in your heart, when you are ready to celebrate birthdays and births and all those wonderful things. And they will be there to support you when you are struggling with loneliness or depression or the loss of somebody. That no matter where you are in that spectrum of life, all of it, we will stand with you and give you community. And we will help you advocate. If you need somebody to stand next to you and advocate, if you need somebody to talk through and wrestle with those issues, whatever that is, this is the community for the unhoused in Boston.
People often ask me, what do you do? How do you help the homeless? How do you help people? And I am not here so much to help as I am to accompany people and to journey with them. There are many times when I cannot change people's mind. I cannot tell them what to do. It is their own choice. I can empower them to try to choose life, to try to choose kindness and goodness, things that honor themselves and that honor others and honor God. But at the end of the day, my job is simply to be present and to show up.
I have a community that's very much like a family in that, you know, we argue, we fight, we have issues with us, but at the end of the day, I feel like we genuinely have each other's backs in a lot of ways. I found since being part of this community what the value of just having someone listen to you when you need to be heard and then genuinely process it and then give you some positive feedback. At times, you can't buy that sometimes, just needing that ear. And I said, this community just has so many, it's a privilege to be part of it. It's a tough community to be part of, but it's one that tests your character, and I love it.
As a family of people who care about each other, heart and soul. They understand when someone has a need, whether it's on a spiritual level, a physical need, anything, they're there. They understand one another so well. And it's a come as you are, you're accepted no matter what. Family.
There's lots of services in Boston, and there's lots of places that you can go that you can work the system and go through the system to get housing. But one of the things that we do that's different is that there's no requirements. You know, we're not going to ask you to fill out paperwork. We're not going to, there's nothing or no boundaries that would separate somebody from this community. We don't have an end, there's no end goal. We're not, you know, we don't find success in making sure everybody's housed. We find success in making sure everybody knows that they are welcomed and that they will be loved for whoever they are and whoever they are in that moment. And we'll see them not as the person that might be sleeping outside, we will see them as their best selves. The person that came in early off the streets to make the cup of coffee, that came in to help push the carts across the street, that came in just to have a good conversation or to dry off their feet. All of that is people's best selves, and that's what we will focus on, and that's what we will see.
I'll tell you about a couple. There's this couple, she's a little older, he's a little younger, and they became volunteers for us. They first came as guests, they got housed, and they still come back to help us out and support us. And even before they were housed, they were helping. Every time they were in to visit, they would help with cleanup, or they'd help take care of things, and as we were, you know, tearing down and putting stuff away at the end of the day, they were always there. They were always helping out. It was their way to give back, which was very important. And a lot of our guests do that. They give back in the only way they can, which is, you know, in-kind support. It's an emotional bond that you develop with these folks, because they're all good at heart. They really are all God's children. They are all God's children. And sometimes you have to discipline your children a little bit. Sometimes your children misbehave a little bit. And then they'll turn around and they'll do something that is the most touching, thoughtful, caring thing that you've ever experienced in your life. And you just want to reach out and embrace them.
So there was a couple who had been coming to Boston Warm every day, and this was one of those couples that always helped out, always did what they could to jump in and clean up or set up or do whatever needed to be done, help with putting the food out. And they were both working, they both had jobs, and they were trying really, really hard to make the housing placement system work for them. All systems out there are broken, all of them are broken, but there are systems, and they function. And these two people had been trying really hard to get housing, and they finally, they were getting close, but they needed some more verification of their circumstances in order to be moved to the top of the list. And my colleague David went down with them to see where they live, where they slept at night. And it was under an underpass in an empty lot strewn with trash and broken glass, fenced in with chain link. And when he saw where these two beautiful, sober, hardworking people were working and living, he broke down and cried. And he took pictures and he took film, and he submitted a statement to the housing agency, and the couple was moved to the top of the list and got housing. And this is just an example of how participation, not as professionals, but just as caring human beings, participation can make all the difference in helping a community to knit back together, to heal some of the fractures of our society.
When people ask me about what does Boston Warm mean to me, there are so many different things that run through my head and through my heart. What I tell people with children, because this is a very personal sort of experience, is I tell them working with this community is the hardest job you'll ever love. It is, there's such a need, and on some days it can be so frustrating and so daunting, and at the same time so rewarding. And as one of our community members has said, I don't know that I'll ever get to heaven, he said, but he says, you know what? When I'm here, I'm in a little bit of heaven. Even if it's the ghetto of heaven, I'm still there.
All right.
when we talk about homeless, I think people have these stereotypes of as someone with mental health, it's someone who's an alcoholic. But no, people who have alcohol problems and might become homeless, but not everybody. We also find on the economic side, to get an apartment in Boston, you have to make at least $26 an hour. And our minimum wage is not even $15 an hour. So many people find themselves pushed out of good housing because they just can't afford it, or they're working in low income, low wage earning jobs and have to work 3 or 4 jobs. And it's really difficult to pull all of that together.
Homelessness is not about laziness, and it's not about lack of effort. Homelessness is fundamentally about disconnection from support networks. It's people who have ended up on the street, especially people who are chronically homeless, their connections have been severed, or maybe were never there for them to begin with. So many people come from backgrounds where the people they most needed and trusted weren't there for them in important ways, parents and guardians. But it may also be the case that through a series of life circumstances, that the connections that we all depend on for our very survival, which we often take for granted and don't realize we do depend on, that those connections have gotten severed.
And then the other piece that's going on in Boston is there is a gentrification movement going on. You know, we have the Millennium Place, which is right down here at Downtown Crossing, and a 1-bedroom or studio condo there is a little less than $1 million. So it seems as though there's a priority for high income living in this city and not really to take care of the average working persons, and the very, very poor people are the people that we find on the street, that live on and in the street.
And it also reflects deep, profound economic inequality in our society. So you can be working full-time in Boston and not be able to afford even a single room because wages are too low and housing prices are too high, and there aren't the opportunities for people.
We had a hearing 2 weeks ago with our coalition of people that we work with to try to reverse a law that's on the books that says that you have to sleep. Before you're eligible for emergency shelter as a family, you have to sleep in a place that's unfit for human habitation for at least 24 hours. So we interviewed a family that had slept in their car for 2 days, a husband and a wife. Both of them work. They have 2 special needs children and 2 therapy dogs. And all of them slept in their car in a parking lot out in Framingham. And both of these people work every day. One's a home health aide, and that is making $12 an hour maybe. So they finally were able to get shelter, but they had to document that they had to live in a place unfit for human habitation. So people go to the bus station, they go to different places to do that.
There's so much social injustice out there. I see it on a daily basis now. I recognize it. That's the big difference, is I walk through Back Bay and I know someone on every street corner now. And I stop and I talk, and even the ones that are, you know, panhandling and trying to get a couple of bucks together for something, the exchange, just the interaction with them lifts them up, because they're recognized as, someone has recognized them as another human being, which is a huge thing.
And I think people also don't understand that after you've been on the street for a while, it becomes harder and harder and harder to get back off the street again. And so some of the folks that you see who look as if they haven't washed or haven't showered, they've gotten pretty beaten down over time. And if you had seen them at the beginning, they would not have looked like that. So this person, I'm going to come up with a name for him. I'm going to call him Bob. Bob had been living under a bridge 12 months a year, 365 days a year in all kinds of weather conditions, including, you know, the bitterest Arctic cold, and dealing with a lot of substance abuse issues, dealing with a lot of mental health issues. And this had been going on, I think, for almost 20 years, that Bob had been living outside and not seeking any kind of shelter. With the help of one of his other ministers, he was finally moved off the street and into housing. There had to be a huge push and to get him into housing. And once he was in, he really felt very strange. The transition off the street and into housing for people who have been chronically unhoused is often the rockiest time of all, because you're terrified of failure. You're really prone to self-sabotage because you aren't sure you can handle it. You aren't sure you can be a success at anything in life. And so some people will just get it over with and fail immediately. It's a very strange transition. Felt absolutely claustrophobic in his nice new apartment with heat and 4 walls. That he wrote an essay about it for the homeless newspaper, the Pilgrim, that was called 4 Walls and Heat. And he felt he was suffocating at first, and he would throw open all the doors and windows, and all of the ministers around him were really anxious to see whether Bob was going to make it at all, or whether he was going to flame out. And one of them had a guinea pig that she was anxious to unload. The children had lost interest in the guinea pig, and it was taking up valuable real estate in their home. And so she had this brilliant idea that she would give Bob the guinea pig, so that there would be a living creature that would depend on him. And it was just like a miracle. Bob hung in there for the sake of this guinea pig and took care of it. And I think the guinea pig is still around, and Bob is still taking good care of this guinea pig and living in his apartment, and the windows are closed. And he brought the guinea pig to the blessing of the animals at the Episcopal Cathedral. And it's just a beautiful story of how, again, the net of relationship, even though strained, turns out to be stronger than our human weaknesses, stronger than our failures, stronger than our demons, that it's stronger.